the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is very familiar for all of us. So there is this guy who actually is obviously accosted, disrobed, beaten up, left almost to die on the streets, on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. But then in the imagery of that situation is obviously of someone who is despondent, who is hurt, who is left almost hopeless. And maybe we should also be able to see such in our imagery. Because there is a principle that Jesus is teaching here. Of course, he is teaching a lawyer. A lawyer has cross-questioned him and imagines possibly that he is trick him or be smart or obviously elicit an answer. Or maybe he was also serious to understand who this neighbor is. But at least because he asked, we have an answer. Because sometimes we wonder who our neighbor is. Whether it is the person who is just beside us, our neighbor in our own societies where we live, or somebody else who is in the workplace, or those types of questions often are there. But since this lesson draws out a quality in the human which is being highlighted as necessary, as an explanation of what love is. So that is what is being elicited here. What love is. Love your neighbor. So the quality that is being brought out to us from this story, the parable, is the act of compassion. Now, if we were to think about the three individuals, the priest, the Levite, as well as the Samaritan, typically who you would have thought that would have responded? Naturally. So if in today's context, if we say a Christian and a lawyer and some common man, an outcast, or in our society there are outcasts also, like the Samaritan was an outcast. And likewise also in our society, are there or no? There are people who are rejected. But here what God is measuring is by compassion. So that means what is very particularly important from what we are seeing here is the characteristics that we represent. Not our name, not the religion, but the characteristic. Because that characteristic is quite the characteristic of God. So we need to make sure, I believe, in our own earnestness of our faith, it is not merely parked by the facts of our identity, by the religion, or by our name. Are we ones who personify qualities that are akin to God's heart, which through this illustration parable is being pointed out? And it doesn't matter what your identity is, almost like that. It doesn't matter what your identity is, because the commandment, the most important commandment is love God. And by its side itself, love your neighbor. So I ask you a trick question. Which is more important? Loving God or loving your neighbor? Because I think in John it says, if you see, you can't say you love your neighbor whom you see. You can't say that you love God whom you don't see if you don't love your neighbor whom you see. So then it kind of in a way answers where the balance lies. If you truly love God, then that cannot escape love for your neighbor. Then we might as well progress in that path so that we are demonstrating that quality in our lives, because that only exhibits our faith. Now, there is no point knowing the parable, or even for that matter, knowing the reference with or without the phone. It's very, very important that we possess characteristic that displays God, because I am saying, even taking it by one step further, if you truly love your neighbor, then our responsibility lies in revealing God to our neighbor who is hurting, who is bound, who is seemingly hopeless. There are many around us. Then, therefore, our duty is that if we love our neighbor, then we would want to naturally introduce by shedding light of who God is for him or her to get into a higher path of life in God. That is the hope. Now, the Samaritan has compassion, but compassion has action that is displayed. You can't say you have compassion, but it isn't demonstrated by action. That's a falsehood. So, your compassion, tasty means if you say tasty coffee or tasty tea, naturally you're looking for tasty coffee and tasty tea. It's not just mere statement. So, which is very critical because I am unable to see how we can truly be intense about our love for our neighbor if the quality of compassion is not so personified in us that he or she or anyone for that matter who knows you is able to see an overflow of compassion in action and thereby is able to raise a question with you as to how you are who you are and what is the reason as to how you are who you are. Christian life is a lot about personifying Christ. It's not about the membership of a church or of a religion. It is more life. So in that situation, when he is on his journey, he notices this need, which Christ is illustrating to the lawyer, but in a way is also teaching us of this generation to learn as to what then he thinks is most important as well as what that true love is. Now, why I am putting that perspective before your eyes is obviously it is that heart of compassion that you carry as your possession is what then enables you to be able to see what is around. Or else you may be, for the guy who went first, he just even possibly he saw something happening, he walked past. So sometimes we are unable even to see just because our hearts are in deficit, not because there is no need. There's so much of need. Then if you have truly a Christian heart, the heart of Christ, I would imagine that there you would also have in a context like this, because it's not the guy who was actually beaten and thrown on the road who alone is your object of attention as recommended by this parable. It's not only the guy who hurt and actually is suffering for his life on the street. They are indeed. But then, how could we really escape the fact that we are set in this world as light and salt? And then here I am emphasizing the fact of the prominence of a quality that is God's, the heart of love and compassion, which needs to be the defining characteristic that we have in our life, because by that alone you get actuated. Or else, what could happen is many other things may be of importance to you, and you don't have the ears and the eyes and the heart to be able to see what is paining and aching around. And you're busy with your life, busy with your work. And people continue to remain hurt without guidance, under bondages, and are struggling because there's no one to shed light. And I'm imagining in a nation like us, there are billions of them, at least a billion, no? Our population. So everywhere there is need. That is why Jesus is saying to his disciples, the harvest is plenty. Pray to the Lord of harvest that he will give more harvesters, workers, in which we and you and I should be prominent workers. Now, prominent workers who are demonstrating compassion means, in my mind, I am thinking, I'm also living as a Christian for many years. I am imagining that almost every day you have an opportunity of a neighbor, just because you have a heart and eye and ears that is hearing, feeling, and responding. Now, apparently, the display of ourselves as one's sons and daughters of God is such a need of our time. Now, here we are talking about compassion. Now, even we as persons of integrity, as persons of humility, as persons of kindness, goodness, long-suffering, of self-control, these are fruits of the Spirit, each one of them. The love and the peace and the joy, all of these are meant to be qualities that are displayed in our life prominently. And I think our foremost responsibility lies, even driven by the fact that we have to love our neighbor as ourselves, which you have said after answering that we understand is as good as loving God. Or in fact, you can't love God unless you love your neighbor. So the love for your neighbor, which again is characterized by your own patience and with your own hope, without getting irritated, endeavoring to shed light requires even your sacrifice. So, how are we spending our time? It's a good measure to see. Is a good deal of our time is directed towards the others and their needs, or is it still as babes only towards ourselves? And then there is a contradiction because God's Spirit, when dwells within us, so naturally the Levite is there, the priest is there, who demonstrate the presence of God's Spirit is understandably the lawyer himself is saying that this man who showed mercy. So that means when we are meant to dwell in God and God's Spirit dwells within us, the characteristics of God would be our defining characteristics. I can't imagine a Christian who cannot be distinguished by the characteristics that are the fruits of God's Spirit and as one absent of love. I cannot imagine because they go almost intermingled. There cannot be a dichotomy that what you believe is on the wall on the screen and what you are is not what you are personifying that in your life. And that you can't say that you're personifying in your life unless it is covered by daily, moment by moment action. Because suppose I say you're a living being. One of the signs of you being a living being is you're breathing. When? Only occasionally. All the time. That's when we say you have life. Or else you are considered dead. Because there is no breath. Quite like that is the logic I'm imagining. And that's how I am thinking how one can love God with all mind, soul, and strength. Love your Lord, your God. First commandment, na? With all what? Heart, mind, soul. So naturally, what ends up happening is these are two chief obligations of man. Your neighbor, are you only able to see them as mere associates or business associates? Or are you able to see them from another angle with the eye of God? Right. Because the harvest is plenty, but the ones that are to harvest are few. Now I am imagining in my mind if only where Christians stepped up in their life and really became the harvesters. There's a multiplication taking place. Of course, if they are added, it's a larger number. But if you're dysfunctional, then that number is also wasted because you are counted, but you are not effective just because your life you have not allowed for it to really represent in such distinct clarity, and therefore you are found deficit and are not being able to be counted in that harvester category. And the number of people that are requiring to be harvested, the fields are plenty, and therefore they are still languishing. And the impact of our lives, the way it was intended, naturally is absent. And this is happening because of the fact of our own deficient attention to the matter of the two foremost commandments that God has given for man: loving God and loving neighbor. So now we see in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 onwards. Of course, when the Son of Man comes, he is going to separate the sheep and the goats and put the sheep on one side and the goats on the other. And 34 it says, and shall the king say unto them on his right hand, come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And he goes on to say on his own, for I was an hungered, and he gave me meat, and I was thirsty, and he gave me drink, and I was a stranger, and he took me in, and naked he clothed me. I was sick, and he visited me, and I was in prison, and he came unto me. And then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee as hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And then, of course, as a contrast, the other category of people also are there who are unrighteous. So there are two categories. When the king shall come in his glory, there will be the two categories which will be differentiated, the righteous and the unrighteous. Now again you see here, So this points about our own representation of who God is in our lives is going to hold on till the end, because we all, in a way, are meant to be finally called to account. Will be called to account. But I'm noticing here, these righteous people, obviously he is separating, but he is distinguishing them on the basis of what they have been in the context of their life on earth. And he highlights those characteristics. But I'm seeing here these people almost like, where have we done? And I'm almost thinking, when you perfect righteousness, when righteousness grows in you, then you don't even know where you are demonstrating that righteousness, because it is an overflow. Wherever you are, and it is uncountable, that your nature in itself is so much displaying God that in almost everything you're touching people's lives. And you don't have a count, because you are geared in that fashion. And there is so plentiful of what you are doing in the line of what God is expecting, of meeting those that are broken and are shattered and are bound, are hopeless, and your life becomes relevant. Christianity has to depart from a focus on ourself. That's not Christ's spirit. He said, I came not to be served, but to serve, not to be served. So often we think more about ourselves. But I'm trying to imagine that what Christ is demonstrating for us to follow is essentially the kingdom of God, God and people. He didn't say love yourself. But then how we manifest? Often we are loving ourselves. We pour upon ourselves, our pleasures, our enjoyment, our thrills. And then when are we going to learn Christ's likeness? Because harvest is plenty. That's an appeal that was there and that is still there today. That means if in those days, Christ's days, and I'm imagining population would have been less, because we are fulfilling God's commandment of filling the earth. And the populations of even in our country has increased so much. So you can imagine how much more multiple times human need is there. And how much more than so many multiple times we have to be people who have outputs that are talkable. The talking point. Christians should become the talking point of the community by their characteristics of Christ. Or else I think we are failing, I'm imagining in my mind, that we are failing to live up to what Christ has really given his life for. And the reasons why fellowships are there, the reasons why churches are there, is for us to really draw further and further by dying to ourselves. I think it is mentioned there. We minimizing and God maximizing. I'm imagining then if we minimize and God maximizes, naturally there is something like a reservoir of a balm that we bring into people's lives wherever we are and whatever may be our calling. Because the overflow of that life that is disposed with compassion towards another will be what they are able to see, and they will naturally inch towards knowing you by who you are, by your characteristic, and not by your appearance. You may have other significant attainments that you may have, or identities you may have. But I am making a point here to challenge all of us. If our identities as Christ with this characteristic is not evident as much as any other identity we have, or even more, then I'm afraid we are failing to live the life that God wished for us to live. I'm not saying don't have identity. I too have an identity. Guy with the French beard, unlike most of you. That's a distinct identity. That's why Jesus is also even saying, when he gives his power to the disciples, because he has powers, he given the powers, he says, go and minister, and even sickness will be healed. But he says, don't make that the point of your identity. Be glad that your name is written in heaven. Because when your name is written in heaven, I'm imagining that then we meet the standards of God, because he cleansed us and he empowers us to become like him. And that's why the righteous he is able to distinguish. They are marked by their characters. And he is not saying anything else about any other identity. You're a great lawyer or a judge or a businessman, or you gave alms. He is judging by their righteousness, by which they are actually exhibiting themselves. So now I'm imagining in my mind, is it then that they were people who had already occupied themselves only with those guys who have beaten by thieves or on the street side or met with accidents on the street side. I'm imagining that wherever they were finding neighbors by their acts of mercy. The whole makeup of an individual as a Christian converts into a state that exhibits Christ every day, wherever you are. That's a true characteristic of a disciple of Jesus Christ. Like we say, like father, like son, like Jesus is children. And you see from the fruits of the Spirit are all our guideposts. Love, not for us to pass a Sunday school exam, because nowadays memory gets tested mostly. I belong to profession of chartered accountancy, and I passed out in 80s. In 80s, our percentages were pass percentages were 2 or 4%. We have 2 stages of exam, intermediate and final. Only 2 or 4% across the nation. And even today, we are only chartered accountants close to 400,000 in the country. Now, I never remember, for me, this tuition was an obsession. We studied using our brain. Not because of the fact of affordability. We had to study. That is challenging our minds, storing knowledge, applying knowledge, and acquiring that knowledge and the skill. Now, even in CA profession today, tuition has become the most important methodology. And therefore, what we are finding is, as a result, people are going to tuition, and tuition masters are telling them what to do, what to write, what not to think about, and pass the exam. And therefore, they end up being individuals who are not really well cooked, well made, because their minds are not really getting so challenged. Memories are strong. So if you give them a work, they may be able to repeat it by good memory. But if you give them fresh set of circumstances, application is poor. So this deficiency somehow even in our education system, even in our churches has become commonplace. We aim to remember. I'm not saying don't remember. But the point is, in that remembrance is not the value. In the knowledge application by skill and insight is the value. Remembrance is not sufficient even for being an exceptional professional. Christianity is also quite like that. It's not how much of the store of knowledge that you have of the scriptures, how much of that has seeped into your life. And people, I'm challenging seriously. People should be able to see that quality manifest in you and be able to speak about it at least in your circles. You say, I am not very social and I am very shy, but you may have 3 or 4 friends at least with whom you are associated. I am thinking Christians should be such that they have these characteristics clearly defined in them, which means continuously, consistently, your character is displayed in all situations. That's when they'll be able to say, you're a kind person. Not when you do one act of kindness. In every situation, because they say, character can't be in any way piecemeal. It kind of gets integrated into you that in all situations, that becomes your makeup. So you can't say, I'm not angry with my boss, but I'm angry with my wife. That means that character is not that you are gentle, you're kind, you're gracious. It's some kind of a fixation that you are having, a behavior at a moment. But it hasn't really sunk into be your character. Because if it is your character, then in all situations you will exhibit it. So you see, love, peace, joy. I said that earlier itself. Forbearance and self-control. So it's not saying, I love you, but is it exhibited, manifest? Even if, suppose his wife is irritating you by some words he's saying, how are you holding out? It's acid test. Not when she is nice, hi, darling. If she says, you are also responding, hi, darling. That's not actually a serious measure. When she is struggling, when she is sick and prolonged sickness, how do you hold out? That is a true test of character. I'm not saying you welcome such situations. But such situations will come always. Because God is testing us continuously by life experience. Is your wife a neighbor? Or you're thinking only somebody else is a neighbor? And don't attach this obligation to your wife because she's your wife. And you don't want to interpret her as neighbor because it can exempt you from that obligation of love. She too is your neighbor because according to the explanation he gave to the lawyer, and the lawyer answered his question, and the man who met that characteristic that Christ wished in love is the man who showed mercy. Now suppose you're a brilliant guy and your wife is not meeting that standard. Suppose IQ levels can be different. Correct, no? We try our best to get compatible partners, but doesn't meet sometime maybe. Are you arrogant? Are you rude? Are you impatient? Or you are gentle and kind and with understanding, carrying your companion, your partner with you? Are all obviously tests. And they're right there for you. And if you fail in those things, you're not growing. And you're waiting for another Sunday for some more boost. No, no, no. With every word that goes in your mind, let's dedicate ourselves to allow it to sink in for Christ to be exhibited, because that is the only means of being able to truly love our neighbor, because it is that characteristics of compassion and mercy that really directs us in one way and not the other. So it's not something that you want to practice tomorrow or day after. Every moment. This is what God is waiting for. I can imagine his heart so filled. Of course, his love is already demonstrated. Now he is carrying a burden that his children will evolve to be like him and more like him and exhibit him and become the talking point of the town. I'm keeping that as my measure for my life. I'm telling you honestly. Because if I don't really set that standard in my mind as prescribed, I don't want to face a day when I wouldn't really make any correction and have no opportunity to prove anything. I'm a rational human being, and likewise you are. And all of us are. We have capacities to think, capacities for logic, capacities for analysis, for inference, for induction. All these powers he has given us, not to be wasted on our pleasures, not to be wasted on our own personal happiness at the neglect of the people who are hurting around us. And there are many. There are many. So we already have seen that if you can't love your neighbor, you can't love God. Because he is the visible object for the flow and demonstration of your love. Right. And I have also said to you how God is exacting. We are very worried about our outcomes in the deliveries that we do. We discuss a lot, correct? Business meetings, we discuss hairstyle, dresses, designing. All these are things which we are constantly seeing, because ultimately it's the outcome that measures your own distinctiveness. I run business with almost so many people. I'm also constantly looking at how we, in a world that is so disruptive and continuously changing, and with so much of competition all around the world, how could we be cutting edge? It's a constant endeavor that defines all our activity. Even certain things that are not really adding value to that ultimate manner in which we need to be, we are dropping, because that takes away our time. Now imagine, for something that is temporal, how much of our own energy and our skills that we are applying, that we should be living in that fashion because we don't want to be left behind. How much we therefore owe to the Most High God. And my prayer and my hope is that we would have those special grace. Am I praying? I'm praying because you can get harvesters, right? From outside also. But why not from within? Right? Even within an organization, we have people, but we are investing so much of developmental efforts in order for them to really be cutting edge. Believe me. So that they will be the ones that are the forces that sustain organization growth as well as sustain the organization for a long time. So much of a focus goes into the making and the shaping of our own individuals for us to be able to be so successful. It's time for the church of God to really work towards shaping and ensuring that we all, each one of us, whether young or old, in our respective spheres, are able to really display the distinctive fragrances of God personified in our life, so that in today's diverse, Pastor said, no, the diverse and the polarized nation. Now, do we then have responsibilities when the so-called leaders are thrusting themselves to destroy the fabric of society? Does it pinch our hearts? Does it touch with our hearts with the sense of responsibility of what we should be doing? Or are we simply imagining that everything will go well? I'm afraid we cannot be silent because, obviously, of the damage, that incorrect thinking, the damage that falsehood, untruth, hatred, prejudices all can bring to the quality of life that you and I can have in the future. So, are we insulated from all of those things? It's a question that I'm wanting to leave with you all. Because if you and I don't really be driven and singed by those factors and find some way in which we can respond, and that could be even living the life that we ought to be living correctly, then we are silent spectators like the priest and the Levite, not ones with a heart of mercy and compassion. And may God speak to our hearts and help us to become the kind of radiating Christians that we need to be by the day and by the hour and by the moment. May God bless us.